another episode of the Dr. Perkins Podcast. The critical thinking question of the day is, why do the Jews have a long list of foods they cannot eat? Feel free to take a pause for some critical thinking. Once you think you know the answer, hit the play button, and I will tell you what I think is going on. Okay, so here's kind of some of the animals that the Jews are allowed to eat for birds. And so here's the breakdown of clean versus unclean. So you have the chicken, the goose, the partridge, the pheasant, the quail, the songbirds, and turkeys. Unclean would be albatross, bats, bittern, crow, eagle, flamingo, osprey, owl, vulture, raven, and birds of prey. And so these beautiful pictures, you can find them on Wikipedia by Anton and then Andrea as well. Alright, so a couple of things that you got. Let's kind of talk about some of these unclean animals. So bats. One of the big things that happened is in Guam and other islands, there were these bats and stuff like that, and the natives just absolutely loved them. And so they ate these animals and everything else. And unfortunately for them, the bats had a neurotoxin, a toxin that would kill nerve cells, brain cells. And so it actually showed up in kind of a weird disease that looked like, caused an Alzheimer's-like dementia. Made it look like they had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where this is you're slowly but surely becoming paralyzed. And then it also kind of looked like Parkinson's. And so this is where you kind of have a shuffling gait, losing your balance and everything else. And eventually it killed death. It killed them. And it became the leading cause of death in the Komodo people. Right here. Another one would be flamingos on this list of unclean animals. And so the flamingo, one of the big things is you run into heavy metals, parasites and bacteria. And unfortunately, it can be a little bit harder to kill these things. And so you definitely have to thoroughly cook them. Now, what about the clean animals? What about the chicken and the turkey? So one of the big things they talk about is you can get what's called a 7 log base 10 kill of turkey and chicken at a temperature of 136 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not that hot, right? Now, here's the thing. You got to hold that temperature for about 64 minutes. Now, what is that 7 log base 10 reduction? Well, that means if I had 10 million bacteria and I cook it at 36 degrees, or I get the internal temperature at 136 degrees for an hour and 5 minutes, we'll say, for every 10 million bacteria I have, I now only have 1, right? And then as I increase the temperature, the amount of time I need to hold at that temperature dramatically drops. It's not very hard to make sure that your chicken and turkey are thoroughly cooked. We can easily get the internal temperature way above that. When I cook meat and stuff like that, I regularly try to get the internal temperature into like the 190s. Alright, so clean and unclean bugs. So clean bugs are beetle and locusts. And so the locust is actually so safe that we're actually using this widespread in food. In many places they're not even labeling it. These beautiful pictures were made by Bug Boy and Diedler Descanses, and they can be found at Wikipedia. But the unclean bugs, right? So a bug that lived off of a carcass, or if it was not a beetle or locust, one of the things you run into is you have bacteria that, for example, Bacillus ceres, sensus stricto, Bacillus cytotoxicus, Bacillus weinhenstrepnius, and Clostridium thermophalmarium have all been found in some of these bugs and stuff like that. And so the problem is with bacillus and with some of these other bugs is they form spores. And so you cook it way up there, and yeah, you killed the bug, but you didn't kill the spore. And so now you cool down your bug, and the spore hatches, and basically you got the bacteria just growing. The other thing is a lot of these will have basically anti-nutrients, and so you have to cook them up to 250 degrees to kill these things. Well, how much of that applies to crickets? Well, the crickets, they have nematodes, and so that's going to be their big problem. So they got nematodes, so you don't want to eat a raw cricket. But the good thing is, you only have to cook it to 130 degrees for 5 minutes, and you killed the nematode. So pretty easy to do there, and now those crickets are nice and safe to eat. So we got some beautiful pictures here for our clean and unclean animals. So this is Keith Weller did this one, and Jean Noel Lafargue did this one over here. And so the rule is it has to divide the hoof and chew the cud, right? It has to do both in order for it to be clean. So bison, goat, lamb, cow, anything like that is going to be a clean animal. Now, if it doesn't divide the hoof, and if it, or if it doesn't chew the cud, it's going to be unclean animal. So bear, cat, coyote, dog, giraffe, pig, zebra, rabbit are all going to be unclean animals right there. All right. And so what's going to happen is with the beef, bison, goat, and lamb, you only have to cook up to about 145 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you eat it raw, there is a risk you can get toxoplasmosis, but it's pretty rare. I mean, I was kind of Googling these, and they were talking about mass numbers of people eating it raw, and there was just a handful of cases in 2018, and then the next article I could find that mentioned any sort of toxoplasmosis was in 1980. Right? Now, I'm not saying eat your lamb raw. I'm not saying that's a good idea. According to the Old Testament, right? According to the Jews, you need to roast these foods in fire. But you can see it's kind of more forgiving. Now, one of the big things is these unclean animals right here. So, for example, we'll pick on pig. Pigs eat carcasses of other animals all the time. And so a lot of times, that animal will die of trichinella. Another thing that you run into is neurocysticercosis, which is another parasite the pig has. And so it can cause seizures, hydrocephalus, stroke-like problems, and death. And this is very common worldwide. So sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America. But we don't see this in places where we have Muslims. Because the Muslims follow a lot of the same dietary restrictions as the Jews. The Jews really don't run into this problem either, because once again, they're not going to be eating these pigs and stuff like that. Alright, so rabbits. Rabbits, they have something called tularemia. And so you might process a rabbit, and he has this sore on his face or whatever, and if you have a cut on your hand, that tularemia can get into that cut, and without treatment, you have a 1 in 10 chance of dying. Alright. Carnivores can have trichinellosis, which can cause months, up to months of, sickness and everything else. Cats have toxoplasmosis. It's such a big issue, they say even be careful with changing their litter. And so, really, another thing they were saying is you weren't allowed to eat an animal that was torn, a beast, or that died of itself. And going back to that thing about the pigs eating carcasses and stuff like that, trichinosis, right? So, animals that died of themselves were way more likely to have a parasite in it. The other thing is animals that were torn of beast. A lot of times a predator will pick on an animal that it sees as sick for whatever reason, whether it's old or whatever. But even that aside, you think about this animal died. How long ago was this animal killed by a beast? Well, most of the time you don't know, right? Unless you actually watched it happen. But assuming we didn't watch it happen, if that animal's been dead for 2 hours, it's not safe to eat. According to the USDA, right? They don't want your meat out at room temperature for more than 2 hours, right? If your meat is above 90 degrees, if the temperature is above 90 degrees, you don't want it out on the counter for more than an hour. That's not safe, right? And so, maybe you got a little bit more time with that than the 2 hour and 1 hour mark. But, I really wouldn't want to push my luck, especially if I'm in a place where I don't have antibiotics and all that good stuff to keep me from getting super duper sick. Talk about the clean and unclean aquatic animals. So these beautiful pictures were made by Yo-Yo 500 and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in order for an animal to be clean, it had to have both fins and scales. So if it just had fins but no scales, it was unclean. Why? Because it didn't have scales. If it just had scales but no fins, it was unclean. Why? It didn't have fins, right? And so here are your clean animals. So your carp, drew, hake, minnow, pike, salmon, sardine, smelt, sole, and tuna. And then your unclean would be catfish, crabs, clams, cockles, dolphins, jellyfish, octopus, oysters, sharks, and shellfish. And so one of the big things is kind of doing some research for this. When I try to find any sort of problem with the clean animals in terms of food safety and stuff like that, in terms of outbreak of infectious disease, I really didn't find any other than a salmonella outbreaks in terms of tuna and maybe salmon and stuff like that. But where did these outbreaks come from? On equipment that had been contaminated with beef and poultry. And so really that's not even the greatest situation there, right? You're having super duper dirty, unclean instruments that you're using to process your food. And so that's the same problem. It's going to happen no matter what you process on that equipment. Now, let's see what you got right here. The next one that you got is with the unclean animals right here. I kind of looked at a few things. So Hong Kong immediately popped up, and they were talking about, they actually had a public service announcement that consumption of bivalve shellfish like cockles, oysters, and clams is strongly associated with a hepatitis A outbreak. All right, and so that's spread through the poop mouth route. That's a major issue here. So let's see, another one that they had I looked up was the octopus. So octopus, it's not uncommon for them to be infected with Vibrio vulnificans. Well, what the heck is that? Well, this can be an absolutely life-threatening infection. And so let's say you're processing octopus, you're healthy as a horse, but you just have a slight cut on your hand. Well, if that octopus had Vibrio vulnificans, it can get into that slight cut and you can be dead within the week. Very fast in terms of killing you. That's even with antibiotics in many cases. If you eat that octopus that had Vibrio vulnificans and you didn't make sure it was properly cooked, it can kill you extremely fast. So it's a major issue here. Now, one of the things, I'm not Jewish or anything like that, but it is interesting to note these clean and unclean animals and stuff like that. And so one of the things is if it's an unclean animal, you really want to make sure it's thoroughly cooked. I just make sure all my meat is thoroughly cooked to 190 degrees. Why so high? Because hepatitis A, you have to cook in at least the 180 degree Fahrenheit range in order to kill it. So that's kind of personally what I like to do, Dr. Perkins. And so, yeah, it's really been interesting kind of researching some of these unclean animals and some of the science behind, what they were doing. All right, that concludes today's episode. If you liked what you heard, be sure to click the subscribe and like button down below. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or if there's any particular topic you'd like me to create a video on, let me know in the comments down below. All right, well, I look forward to seeing you on my next podcast.